Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning into the Functional Fighters podcast. In a moment, you're going to hear the intro to our show, and you're going to hear us say the wrong name.
That's because just before we published the very first episode, we found out somebody else beat us to the punch.
Pun fully intended.
So we needed to find a new name.
And since we're overachievers, we had recorded several episodes before we discovered this. So we will have it fixed a few episodes in. We live, we learn, and now on with the show.
Hello, world. I'm Dan McCarthy,
I'm Brian Basaga.
and welcome to Striking Thoughts.
This is our podcast, a discussion on martial arts as it relates to self defense, practical applications, theory, history, applicability in the modern world, and our goal in talking about that stuff is to help make you a better martial artist and get the most out of your training that you can.
So today's topic that we have on board, I'm really excited for. We're talking about strategy versus tactics versus technique, and what should you be learning and when. So this is a pretty heavyweight topic in my opinion as a teacher. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun. Come along with us on the ride for this. So let's jump right into it, Brian.
Yeah, I think the first step on this training station is defining exactly what we mean when we use those three words. So strategy, tactics, technique. Um, I think you look across media in general, and it's these words are overused, underused, misused, confused, overlapped. So let's just get started on the right foot here and say, what do we mean when we're talking about strategy?
Sure. So, my understanding from like a technical definition, and yeah, a lot of times these get thrown around is strategy is broad. Strategy is the big picture, is what you're looking at. Whereas tactics are little things that you do to support your overarching strategy. So they're clearly interrelated to each other. They work together to really formulate what your battle plan is. But one of the ways I like to look at it is I should be able to sum up my strategy in maybe even 1 to 2 words. If you're looking at what somebody's strategy is in a fight, their strategy overall might be control. My strategy is I want to control. Um, Maybe their strategy in the situation um, is incapacitate. So those sound like they could be the same things, but there's a subtle difference between the two, right? Um, because one might allow for a little bit more destruction or damage to the person than the other, and another strategy might just simply be I'm going to destroy you. Maybe that's what your overall strategy is, you know.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I think I can give a non-martial arts example. Recently, and we can bring this over into martial arts examples as we go through our discussion today. But I recently read a book. It was the autobiography of Stanley McChrystal, who was a four-star general in the U.S. military. And his last command was in Afghanistan. I can't remember the exact years that it was. It was, I think he was probably done around 2010. So, at the time, his strategy for the, conflict in Afghanistan after reviewing the situation on the ground was the way to win against the Taliban was to make them irrelevant, right? They were actually gaining control of parts of that country by providing things there that the government couldn't provide, right? Whether it be rule of law or services or different things. That's kind of how they built their inroads into the country. So his strategy was, well, if that's their source of power, I'll just provide a better alternative. and make them irrelevant. So how did
Right.
he? What tactics did he employ to do that? Right. One example I can remember from the book was, there was one province where, um, they're just basically the main government of Afghanistan was absent. So there was no rule of law. There was nothing. It was just kind of chaotic until the Taliban got there and installed their own. So what did he do? He's like, well, we're going to put government functions back in this province. So he, found people, Afghanis who could, were lawyers or judges or different things, and brought them there and made a safe space in the city by, using his troops to clear the enemy from the area and set up a working, government, right? And so that was his strategy and his tactics, and the technique, of course, was, down to, well, how do you actually get, insurgent forces out of an area. I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about that, but you can see how one flows into the other until you actually have boots on the ground, and then you're physically doing something, right?
I think that was a really great example. Honestly, I think that was a real clear cut example of how the flow happens. What's the strategy? What's a tactic that works with it, and even down to technique. That was really well illustrated.
Yeah. So another interesting question I think that we may touch on as we go through here today is, can you find all three of these things in every martial arts system?
I'm gonna go ahead and tell you no. Um, I'm gonna answer that in a nutshell and say no. I will say in my experience, and let me backpedal that just a skosh in the statement that when you look at a martial arts system, um, there are any number of practitioners of any given system across the world. It might be a very small system that is one of those kung fu systems that's handed down from father to son, and there's maybe like 5 practitioners on the planet, or it might be ATA Taekwondo, which is practiced by hundreds of thousands of people all over the planet, and stuff like that. And it could be anything in between. And of course, there's different flavors of each of these things. So no answer is universal. You couldn't look at something and go, well, karate doesn't have a strategy. That's not a good answer, because that's just a really quick dismissal when there's several different versions of karate out there, and even within each of those, they're not going to be taught the same. So I will definitely go out on a limb here and say I've trained in schools where all three couldn't be found. They didn't have the ability to teach all three, so I've lived the experience of something missing. So I would say it's not universal that every martial arts school, that every teacher has the ability to teach all three of these.
Yeah, I think you're correct. There's a couple ways these things can be missing from your system, right? It could be the system never had it to begin with, right?
Right.
It could be that it's been lost to time,
Right.
or at least in the lineage of whatever instructor you have in front of you at that point. You know what I mean? Or
Yeah.
or it could so he was never taught, right? Maybe
Right.
his master had it, but he doesn't, he missed the bus or whatever, for whatever reason he doesn't have that. Or it could just be too that, you know um, your particular instructor has misinterpreted or, de-emphasized it in a way, right? And just
Yeah.
isn't part of his teaching curriculum. For me, again, as through this lens, as a practical martial artist, I think this is a good test. Like, once you understand these things and you know how to kind of look for them in your training, this is kind of a test on, is the system I'm in really a self-defense applicable system or not, right? Is the
Right.
instruction I'm getting right now really going to be adequate for that? Because I will say you have to have all three of these things in order to be successful. right?
I would say that's a true statement, unless you have, the best of luck on your side. I mean, some people are successful in spite of the fact that maybe something is missing. I've seen that. I've seen people who are so good at something on let's say on an intrinsic level, that they don't know how to articulate what they do. Maybe they have all three, but they don't comprehend how they all exist. Um, so they can't impart that wisdom to another person, right?
Right. Hmm.
They have it, but it's on an intrinsic level. So they fail at being able to explain why what they do works, regardless of the fact that they can make it work.
Yeah, there's actually been a few. There's examples of that all over the place. I can remember one of my, sports radio shows I listened to in the morning. They were talking about this football player who had some incredible technique for being able to like clear a guy's hands from his body. He was like a pass rusher type of guy, right? So he just had some incredible thing he could do where he could just like take these huge guys and just like completely clear their hands away from his body and get around them and go after the quarterback. And so like the coach is like, hey, buddy, like you have to teach this to the rest of the guys on your team because if everybody
Right.
can do this, we'll be unstoppable. And he
Not
couldn't
a
explain
teacher.
it. He just couldn't do it, right?
Not a
And he's
teacher.
like, they tried and tried and tried, and he's like, sorry, I guess I could do it, but I can't teach it. So
Yeah,
that is a real thing.
well, teaching in and of itself, I think we both know teaching is a separate skill. It is a completely different skill, and anybody who actually has a high level of teaching acumen, and they have that ability to teach, it doesn't matter what the subject matter is. If you give them a subject matter and they reach a reasonable level of understanding, comprehension of the subject matter, they'll be able to teach that to somebody else, even if they're not an expert in that field, because they're an expert teacher. Um, so, case in point, maybe your field of study is martial arts, sure, but somebody comes to you with a different kind of problem, like a math problem. Well, maybe I don't have advanced math skills. I didn't go beyond trig in school. Okay, so that's not something that I didn't get into, like calculus and all those kinds of things. But I have a teacher's brain, so I can look at somebody who is doing more advanced math than me, and if they can at least explain the concept to me, I can explain it back to them better. Because I can hear, I can comprehend, and then I can teach them how to break down what their problem is. I have a friend who is talking to me about their statistics class in grad school. I never took statistics. That's not something I've ever done, but they're talking about one of the different types of graphs that they're doing. I've never even seen this graph in my life. I took one look at the graph, and I read a very fast explanation. Went, oh, okay, I understand this. Here's what you're dealing with, and I just changed the language. And they're like, that makes sense. It's not because I've got skills in statistics. It's just because I'm a teacher. So there are absolutely those people who can do something, but they can't explain it. They can't teach it.
Yeah, I mean that's a good, excellent point as well. Not every black belt or even every depending on your system, right? Even every master level student is really qualified to be a teacher, right?
Agreed.
So
Yep. Agreed. Agreed. 100%. Actually, there's a topic right there in what you just said, which is
nice.
the topic I'm hearing is what qualifies somebody, quote unquote, as a master. That'd be a fun conversation. Um, but
Yeah,
anyway, I
yeah.
digress.
Make sure our producer's writing that one down.
Oh, he's got it. It's
All right,
right.
excellent.
It's right in front of me. He took the cue there. So, yeah, so when we start looking at these things, um, what do you think is? Let's talk about the strategy side of things. What do you think would be like the overarching strategies that are available to somebody in the martial arts? Let's just take it from our wheelhouse of self defense. If you're in a self defense, not a ring fight, you're in a down and dirty street brawl for your life. What are the strategies that we have available to us, whether we select that to be our choice of strategy or not? What do we got?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good self-defense martial arts program will spend a fair amount of time talking to you about a strategy to avoid getting into a self-defense situation to begin with,
So
right?
conflict avoidance.
Right, avoidance, just general, awareness and preparation. I think goes along with that, right? So the strategies that you employ to see trouble coming before it gets there, right, and avoid
Mm.
it. How to make some good decisions to stay away from that stuff. So, and I think that's you know, so that's going way back, right? So if I can
Hmm.
avoid, like that's a strategy I need to train on, and it's not like totally intuitive either. You know what I mean? Like you talk to people about like, well, the best, we say in our classes a lot, well, the best thing to do is just not to be in this situation. And they're like, oh, well, yeah, of course, that's best.
Of
But like,
course.
how do
Right.
you can't guarantee that that happens. And it's true. You can't guarantee that you'll never be in that situation. But there are actually a lot of things you can do to help your odds, right?
Absolutely.
We talk about the awareness cycle and just even just things like subconscious things that you're doing in your daily life that make you oblivious to what's going on around you.
I got a real
Ways to
good
break that,
example.
right?
I got a real good example that is a real world example from one of our former students. This would have been maybe like 8 or 9 years ago. But we had a student at the old school who did train with us all the way up to black belt. This gentleman, and he told me about a self defense situation he got into, and overall, I think he handled it well. Um, and what I think was the piece that was missing was really that level of awareness that could have avoided the conflict to begin with. So here's the very quick bullet points of the story. Guy was driving from Omaha to Council Bluffs and crossing the bridge over the river, and he must have inadvertently cut somebody off and caused a road rage
Oh my God.
situation. He didn't intend to make somebody angry, but he did. And he continued about his way and pulled into a gas station, got out of his car at the gas station, going to the gas station. This guy followed him, got out of his car, and threw a punch at him. Um, and so he perceived what was going on before he was attacked. He was able to figure it out. So that's great. Punch came, and he was able to deflect the punch and take control of the guy and put him in. I don't remember the actual technique used,
I think it was
unfortunately.
Hammerlock. I remember this story now that you're
You
talking
do? Okay, cool. I thought it might have been a hammerlock to a choke. I just couldn't remember for certain if it was that or not. Um, but he put the guy in a restraint position and just explained to him, listen, I don't want to fight with you. I'm sorry I made you angry, but I think we're done here. And the guy agreed with him, and he pushed the guy away, and he got in a position to protect himself. Now, I would say that was a situation overall that was really well handled. I think the gold star from my perspective as the teacher would have been, is there any way possible before he got out of his car he might have noticed that guy had followed him?
about. Mhm.
And the avoidance at that point would have been, don't get out of your car, right? Guy's not going to punch you if you're sitting in your car with the door locked. But that might be a little bit of wishful thinking on my part. But if it was a perfect scenario, he would have noticed before he got out of his car that guy had followed him. And I think overall it was a great example of a self-defense situation, overall executed really well. He didn't get hurt. He didn't have to hurt the other person to make the guy realize he didn't want any trouble. There was no further attack after that. They went their separate ways. Over, done.
Yeah, certainly. I think, that goes to, I guess, just stepping back for a second here. For those people listening, who might not know what hammer lock means, it's a shoulder lock, kind of the old twist your arm behind your back kind of lock that pretty much every joint locking martial arts system has some version of that.
Or
But anyway,
if you get put into it by a bully on the playground like I did every day.
yeah, there you go. I was going to say, that goes into the continuous thing. We do, after action reports. Like everybody does that, right? I mean, um, a good martial artist will do it. Police officers do it. Military people do it. Like, something happened. This is how we responded. What went well? What didn't go so well? What can we do better next time? That's part of building your awareness and avoidance capability in the martial arts is going through that cycle with yourself. Even on little things, right? Like the one thing we talk about so much with students, particularly younger students, is this damn thing. Like this is a perception killer right here, right? Because what do? You're staring at it like this, right? And your field of view gets to be about that narrow. And I mean, anybody could walk up to you and do anything, right? The place could be on fire. It could be somebody robbing something right over there. And you might not even notice because you're staring at this thing. So just even planting the seed, like, hey, if you realize that like you haven't seen anything but your phone in the last 30 seconds, like just stop and look around, right? And just that's how we start to get better. Then you realize like the next thing to work on then is like, okay, so don't look at this in public, or at least, I use the mall as an example. I don't know if people actually go to malls anymore, but if you're walking around the mall and you're staring, that is not the time to be staring at things, right? Like pay attention to what's going on around you, do your business. When you're back home, that's the time to look at your phone, or if you're in a safe place, or there are safer places to do that. So I'd say we talked about conflict avoidance. I think, and then the next thing you're going to get into is, so if there's going to be a conflict, like what is your strategy going to be?
Right.
And I think this varies pretty widely, right?
Agreed.
Amongst the martial arts. I think there are martial arts systems that are very popular that pretty much subscribe to the I guess we call it the overkill strategy, right? Like just overwhelm them with force and aggression, and that's how you're gonna, come out on top of this conflict, right?
Exact right amount of kill.
Is overkill. That's right. Uh, so that's
Right.
a strategy. I mean, that is a strategy, right? Just
Yes, it
I'm
is.
gonna be the biggest, meanest dog on the block, and that's if somebody's gonna mess with me, I'm gonna unleash that to my full potential.
Yeah.
Um, I have some feelings about how good a strategy that is for.
Well, the one of the things to kind of temper that statement right there is, as self defense practitioners and also instructors, we've got a responsibility. If you're listening to this podcast, one of the things that we really try to keep in mind is, when we teach a student, we've got three key places we're trying to keep that student from going to. We don't want our student to go to the hospital. We don't want them to go to jail. And we also don't want them to go to the morgue. So while we're teaching practical self defense, as the teacher, we try to keep all three of these things in mind, because a strategy of overkill, as Brian is saying, could put you very easily in the position where you don't go to the hospital and you don't go to the morgue. Great, but you might really end up in jail
Yeah,
for 5 to 10. Who knows? So, and there are those who would say that's better than dead or in the hospital, and that very well could be the case. I would take 5 years in prison over dead, that's for sure. Me, myself, and I. But
yeah,
that's up to the individual practitioner really to make a decision on. It's not my business to tell a student which of those situations is better or worse.
yeah. So to be clear, like aggression and violence of action, right? Definitely you have to have those things to survive a conflict, some type of any type of combat, right? You have to have those things. I think the where you run into trouble, as you were just saying, Dan, is like if that's the only option that you have, like if
Yeah.
the old adage, right? If all you have is a
A
hammer, every
hammer.
problem starts to look like a nail,
Yep.
right?
Exactly.
So that's where you can kind of get into some trouble there. I saw a this was back when I just started up my program here after moving back to Indiana. I had a student that had been training with me for a couple months, was really excited and doing really well, and he comes in and hands me a stack of DVDs one day, right? And he says, you know, uh, my buddy at work, he found out I'm doing this martial arts stuff, and he gave me this video series, and I watched it, and the stuff is, it's like, hey, it's like I won't tell you too much about the stuff. I want you to watch it and tell me what you think. It's pretty intense. And so I'm like, oh, sure, I'll pop it in and see what's going on. It was a self defense video series, and it was filmed from a seminar. Like they were teaching this to a group of students who had obviously paid to be there. Bunch of ex elite military type guys, and
Ooh. Uh-oh.
yeah, I mean they were showing some techniques. They basically the whole video that I watched. There was like four DVDs. I only watched one of them. I only needed to watch one of them.
Right.
The stuff they were showing, you cannot argue that it is extremely effective, right? I mean, it was all about targeting. There were pretty much, four targets that they went for in that video. One was
Throat.
throat, one was the back of the eye socket, um, and I can't remember. There was another one. I remember the third one was actually the pubic bone, right?
Sure.
The weakest part of the pelvis, pubic bone,
Yep.
which is if you're not familiar with anatomy, it's basically right between your legs, between the front and the back, so to speak,
Yep.
down there. So there were those three, and then there was another. I can't remember what the fourth one was, but anyway, these are all points to attack that cause severe injury,
Mm-hmm.
right? And as a result of that severe injury, it's incapacitation, right? And certainly, everything that they showed would do exactly what they said it was going to do, right? The problem was like all these guys who went there for I don't know what it was, an 8 or 16 hour weekend martial arts course. When they left, that's all they knew,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
going back to the example of our former student, if he had been to this seminar and that happened the next day, what he knew to do was to deflect that punch, crush the other guy's throat, gouge his eyes out, and break his pelvis,
Right.
right?
Right.
Or a road rage incident,
Right.
and where would he have been? Not the
Jail for
morgue,
sure.
not the hospital, but
Ah.
probably in the jail, right? So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, you know, that's where context matters so much, right? I mean, those guys who are teaching that stuff, they're the guys who literally like put their lives in danger every day, right? I mean, they go, they leave for work and they're wearing body armor and they know they're going to go get in a life or death fight, right?
Right.
So that is a perfectly applicable strategy and set of tactics for them to employ.
Yeah.
So there's no messing around with what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
There are other really popular systems today that have military roots that have similar strategies and tactics that follow from them, right?
Yeah.
Um, and hopefully I haven't trained in any of them myself, so I really don't know. But hopefully they're doing a good job of broadening that from its original developed purpose, right? To make a martial arts system that's still effective, but also applicable to modern civilian society.
Right. Well, the along that lines, it's kind of cool to notice we haven't even talked about any techniques really. We've just kind of talked strategy at a high level, and the cool thing is if you understand that strategy and tactics and technique aren't the same thing, like we're discussing right now, then what happens is you can take an overall strategy and you can teach that strategic mindset to a civilian, a law enforcement officer, and also to a military personnel. You can teach the same strategy to those three groups, but you can change the tactics and the techniques that you teach to them and still have the strategy be applicable. And
Hmm.
that's something that's really cool of understanding exactly what we're talking about, which is these three things all support each other, but can be separated into separate concepts. Um, and now, so we talked about like conflict avoidance, all the way on the yin, and on the yang side here would be overkill. So really, you can find any level in between there. To start talking about strategy, and I would say kind of the middle ground is control. um, you aren't at the point of doing avoidance at all cost, and you're not at the point of you're going to completely break this person. But somewhere in the middle is this level of I'm going to control the situation so it doesn't get out of hand. Um, and I guess you could probably ping pong uh, either to the right or to the left of that to whatever degree that you need to, you know. But so I guess the next thing would be, well, what do we mean when we start talking about a tactic? What's a tactic, right? We got the idea of a strategy. So I'll give a
Yeah.
quick example of what's the difference between a strategy and a tactic. So let's say that my strategy is to control, like I just stated. Then a tactic for control might be for me to take the person to the ground, right? I haven't actually said how I intend to do so, which means it's not a technique, right? But my tactical choice was because I want to control this person, and it's easier for me to put them on to the ground for finding leverage and finding a way to control them. I'm going to put them on the ground. Now,
Right.
there's
Right.
several ways that I could do that, right? So that's the difference between a tactic and a technique. The
Yeah.
tactic
Absolutely.
is takedown, right? But I could choose a dozen techniques that could fulfill that tactic, right?
Yeah. Absolutely true. And then you can see different systems that work on that control. Like if we stick with just the control strategy, right? You can see different systems that approach that different ways, right? For instance, the very popular ground fighting jujitsu systems, right? The Gracie styles and the other ones that you see popping up as offshoots of that. Like their strategy for control is their strategy is control. Their tactics are I'm going to get on the ground with someone and be better at fighting on the ground than they are, right? And that's how I'm going to gain control of the situation. Now they've got hundreds of techniques for how do I get that person on the ground, right? And then what do I do? Once they're down there, what does control look like, right? How do I choking
Yeah.
them, locking an arm? There's all kinds of techniques that flow from that. I think you
Yeah.
go to um, another system. I'm going to use I know I go back to hapkido a lot because that's what I know. Right? But um, I would say our one of our primary tactics in hapkido is not necessarily, we do takedowns, but I think the primary tactic is actually balance disruption. Right? Most of our techniques are designed to disrupt the other person's ability to fight back, right? There's a lot of ways I can do that. I can do that with joint locks. I can do that with trapping,
Sweeps.
direct balance disruption, sweeps. Like there's all kinds of different techniques that flow into that. But really, balance disruption is a primary tactic aimed at our strategy of control.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Very true.
and I look at another system like Kempo, right? my daughter trains in Kempo, so I sit and watch a lot of her classes and some of the adult classes that go on at that school. Right, they're more on the overkill end of the spectrum, right?
Yep.
And they don't do a lot of control, right? Most of their strategy is, to just hit harder,
Overwhelm.
hit smarter, and just
Strike
physically,
first, strike hard, no mercy,
yeah,
sir.
exactly. Just overwhelm them, right? You're gonna be stronger, you're gonna be faster, you're gonna know the right points to hit, and you're gonna take their ability to fight away because you've broken them down that way.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's really a very true thing, and I would say that, and hopefully nobody who's listening to this feels like we're stereotyping martial arts, because I think Brian and I both have a lot of experience with different martial arts, but I don't think either one of us would say we know everything about every system. So we can only dictate our experiences we've seen, and my experience with Kempo is very much similar to what you've said, and I've trained with a couple of Kempo instructors, and I have a couple that are friends. And I would definitely say that tends to be the Kempo tendency is overwhelming force.
Yeah.
And that's not a judgment, that's just a perception I have of it, both as somebody who trained in it for a short period of time and as somebody who has got friends that teach it, and I kind of observe how they do things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to just pick up on that a little bit further. What's bad, right? I mean, in my opinion, like, so there can be any of these three things: strategy, tactics, technique. Any of these three things can be bad, right? I mean, they can just not work, right?
Right.
I'm trying to think of a stupid example here, right? But like, my strategy to dry out the bathroom towel is to leave it in the shower with the shower running, right? I mean, that's just
That's
that's a
bad
bad
strategy.
strategy, and bad tactics, and bad technique right there,
Right.
right? It's not going to work. So there are martial arts systems that teach bad all of those things. Uh, I think, as the stuff we're mentioning here, I think the most important thing for a student of the martial arts is to understand what that strategy is, right?
Yeah.
Learn enough about what those tactics and techniques are that you can start to understand, you'll start to understand if these things really fit together, right? Um, and then you can make your own judgment call about whether it's the right strategy or tactics for you.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
think I think that has a lot to do with it, because and I think that has a lot to do with why there are so many different variations on martial arts in the world, because at the end of the day, we haven't evolved that much in the last 150,000 years. So how a human moves is how a human moves. How a human grows is how a human grows. So there really truthfully is a finite level of technique, and there's a finite level of strategy, and there's a finite level of tactics, because it's just that we have to be governed by our own anatomy, our own physiology, kinesiology, physics, um, all of those things, kind of psychology. Those things all have a lot to do with it. So somebody might fit perfectly into Kempo just because they understand the overall mindset of it, and so again, the strategy, tactics, and technique just really fits with them, and there's nothing wrong with that. Whereas somebody might fit better into Shaolin Kung Fu, just to throw a different martial art out there that we haven't talked about yet, just to give a different example. And I think that's why the world allows for so many different martial arts. I think it has everything to do with the variety in human psychology and personality, as opposed to the concrete concepts of anatomy and physiology, right? Because a punch is a punch,
Right. Yeah.
oh,
Exactly.
right? To give an example of bad technique, just like you were talking a minute ago about when these go wrong, it doesn't matter if you're doing kempo or if you're doing taekwondo or if you're doing boxing even. Okay, if you punch with your wrist like this and you try to hit something like this, you're going to hurt yourself, and that has nothing to do with what system of martial art you train in. Your technique sucks. It's that simple, regardless of who taught it to you or what the systematic choice is. You're doing it wrong. It's that simple, right? So um, if you have a good technique, you have a good solid wrist position, and you execute everything with the proper mechanics, then you have a solid punch. Again, regardless of whether it's boxing or it's karate, that doesn't really matter so much as long as under the right circumstances you can execute that punch. You know, but
Yeah.
maybe you would learn how to do it better under a boxing um, um, environment. That's the word I
Right.
want. Maybe the environment, the coaching style, and the way that the program is conducted speaks to you more than a traditional karate class. That's fine, you know.
Yeah, sure. And I think, other things can happen to you during the course of your training too, is, you could you could get to a point in your training where you realize that, what, I am just never going to be a heavy hitter. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the heaviest hitter in the world either, right? There's a lot of people smaller than me who can hit a lot harder than I
Yeah.
can. And I'm in relatively good shape. I mean, I work out and I take care of myself, but it's just however my body is, I'm not the heaviest hitter in the world, and I never will be, right? And if you're that's where compatibility for the person comes in. If the system you're training in has got good strategy and good tactics and all the techniques kind of to make those work rely on you being able to, you know, crack off the corner of oak tables at will, with just the palm of your hand, and you can't get there, right? Well, then that's just not the strategy for you, right?
Right. Square peg in a round hole.
Yeah, exactly, and that's fine. You see that there are other martial arts. Then you go take what you learn from that system, and you find a new one, and you add to it, right? And
Yeah.
eventually find,
Absolutely.
you'll find a home.
One
Um,
of our mutual students, whom we've talked about previously, was in class this week. He's been in town visiting, which is always a treat. I love that. But since he's left our nest, as it were, since he's left our nest, he's gone on to other things that have always piqued his curiosity, like BJJ and Muay Thai and things like that. And he's become very accomplished on the ground, very much so. And you can just tell he's happy as a clam to be able to go to the ground and work his ground game and all that kind of stuff. But the interesting thing from my perspective has been as his teacher to watch him go from what we taught him to kind of complete confusion of, oh, well, this is completely different, but this is what I want to do. And it's like, well, we taught him, he couldn't figure out how to integrate these
yeah,
things. He had to kind of put this on a shelf for a while and pick up the new game, the new toy, and learn how to play that. But now, after years of doing that, I'm seeing him be able to integrate them. So he hasn't taken his former training and just completely shelved it and gone, this is useless. He's gone, okay, now that I understand this part as well as I understand this part, now I know how to fit them together. And that's cool.
right. Yeah, yeah, very cool. It's always add, right? That's one of my first instructors said. You want to take, the things you've learned and add to them, not
Mm-hmm.
forget them, right? And that's certainly true in the martial arts, because when it comes down to it, like we said earlier today, the body only works in so many ways. So a lot of these things appear in multiple systems with just a slightly different viewpoint on them. And once you put those things together, it can really create some light bulb moments for you.
Yeah.
I'd like to move on and make sure we talk about technique a bit here, because um, there are zillions, unlimited numbers of techniques out there. Um, and I guess the thing that people always kind of get into, they get into these little like arguments. You just talk to this martial artist or that martial artist, and you're like, well, I punch like this, and I saw you punch like that, but it's better to punch like this, right? It's like not
Whatever.
really. It's different, right? It's
Whatever. Yeah.
different. Yeah, it's not better. It's not worse. It's different. Both of those things work and are valid, right? The
Yeah.
example you gave before is like, okay, let's make a fist like this and now punch like that's a bad technique, right? That
Yeah.
technique is never applicable.
Right.
So there's a few, I guess how like what advice can we give to our listeners in terms of how do you smell out a truly bad technique, not one that you don't like doing because it's hard for your body style or requires conditioning or flexibility you don't have like that. There's a lot of techniques I don't like, right? But they
Sure.
work versus
Right.
a bad technique.
So the first thing there is actually a very easy thing to articulate, but takes training to understand, which is you have to understand anatomical alignment because when it comes to force meets force, and so we're talking physics now. When it comes to force on force, and when you got every action has equal opposite reaction, and
Mm-hmm.
two things hit each other. When this punch hits this hand, the punch is being hit by the hand at the same time. That's elementary Newtonian physics. Okay, so without getting into it too hard, you have to understand that the place that the technique will fail on either side, whether it's this side or this side, is the place where there is the most structural weakness. Okay, like architecture. So no matter what happens, this and this, when they hit, they're both being hit by the same amount of force. Whichever one has the single weakest point, that's where the failure is going to happen. So you have to understand kind of anatomical weaknesses.
Right.
And the first place to spot those is always joints. So you look at the wrist, you look at the elbow, you look at the shoulder, you look at the hip, you look at the knee, you look at the ankle. You look at those things first and foremost. And if you can kind of learn in particular to look at those 6 points, again, wrist, elbow, shoulder, hip, knee, ankle. If you learn to look at those in particular, you can quickly start to spot where a technique is going to fail. And that's really good. That's really good technique triage for a green instructor. If you're a brand new instructor, then take a look at those 6 body points on your students. You're going to start to figure out where your students are going to get hurt or where their technique is going to fail, and you can start fixing from there. But if you're just a student, pay attention to those things when your instructor teaches a technique. What's their wrist doing? What's their elbow doing? So on and so forth.
Yeah, certainly touched on a lot of good points there about just general how can a good technique go bad as well as how can a technique that's set up to get some of that stuff out of alignment, right?
Yeah.
Just is a bad technique. I think the key, the place I see this come up all the time is in defense against weapons, right? Somebody's attacking me with a knife or a gun or something like that, and
And I'm going to crescent kick it.
what technique do I do to get out of it? Yeah, exactly. Like that's the classical example right there. Is the I'm going to kick the gun out of the guy's hand, right? I
Right.
mean,
And get shot for my trouble.
exactly. Like get shot before my foot's off the ground, right? So, you know, so how do you know that that stuff's coming? I think it comes down to again something that you have to have some education to understand, right? Like you have to understand the physiology of action and reaction and how long it takes the body to process a signal and do something in response to it versus how long it takes you to execute a technique, right? I mean, anybody who understands that, the third of a second it takes for the person to perceive that you're moving your foot and another third of a second to send a signal to a trigger finger is way faster than the travel time between your foot and their hand, right?
Yeah.
Like that technique just it's not going to work, right? I mean, you'd have
Right.
to catch the guy literally sleeping. I mean, I'm sure someone could probably come up with an example of a time it did work, right? And I'll just tell you, it worked because the other person wasn't ready for it, right?
Right.
I mean, the other person was engaged in a different mental process, and so their timer didn't start at the same time your timer did. It's tough
That
to
doesn't
rely on
make it a
that
good
happening every
technique.
time, right? It doesn't make it a good technique. It doesn't make it
Right.
a foolproof technique.
Well,
So
just with what you're saying right now, we should make mention of this because the problem with a technique like that, I mean, clearly you know it's a bad technique. I know it's a bad technique. And I hope that anybody who happens to hear this isn't suddenly now getting the light bulb of that's a bad technique. You know, I hope the problem comes in with when the instructor teaches a technique to a student, and the student foregoes any common sense and just goes, okay. And that's part of the cult of personality of martial arts, number one, which is a problem in and of itself. And then the other side of things is sometimes it's just as simple as it is an adult instructor who actually doesn't have experience in those things, and they're teaching something to maybe a child. So the child takes on blind faith, something that they don't have the maturity to understand and the level of common sense to think about it. So something to think about, and Brian's already said this a couple of times in this conversation, which is be discerning in your training and be willing to question things and not just take stuff at face value. A good instructor will take a question from a student. Be respectful. Respect your
yes,
teacher.
absolutely.
Um,
There's a
don't
good
be a
way to
jerk
ask the
about
question
it.
and a bad way to ask the question, but ask the
Yeah,
question the good way.
yeah. Don't be a jerk about it. But by all means, ask a question when a technique doesn't make any sense to you, or when you think that maybe there is room to challenge the validity of the technique. I don't care if you're in my class and you want to understand a technique better, and you're like, I think that looks like a crock. I don't think that'll work at all. Then we can. I would take the time to work on that in class. We can absolutely do that. That's not a big deal, as long as you are remembering that I'm also a person and I deserve dignity. Don't be a jerk about it, but by all means, ask your question and let's explore that and see what comes of it. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good, a well-designed system can, and a highly effective instructor, right, can take the technique, tie it back to the tactics that you're employing to meet your strategy, right?
Right.
And a lot of times, like when something just doesn't make sense, it's because the student just isn't making the connection at one of those points,
Yeah.
right? And so if you can kind of bring it back, or there's something they're physically doing wrong, like, yeah, I'm doing this, but it isn't working. They're not off balance, or they didn't fall down, whatever the technique may be, right? It's like, well, fix the technique first,
Yep.
right? Make sure that you're doing the right thing, and then we'll look at, are we employing the technique the way it was intended to be employed, or in the situation it was intended to be employed in, right? And
Yeah.
then just kind of work it back up the chain until we figure out where it isn't, where it wasn't clicking.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, seriously, if you're going to be a self-defense practitioner, you have to be willing to put yourself in the game and be invested. So you need to ask questions of your teacher, and um, I would I would counsel that I think it is in your best interest as a self defense practitioner that if you have a teacher who doesn't like to be questioned ever, doesn't want to be questioned, that is a very suspicious situation in my mind. Again, if you're asking questions in a respectful manner and at the time your teacher expects a question to come, then they should be willing to sit down and talk to you, entertain your questions, and think about them. And a really good instructor doesn't have a problem with telling you when they don't know something. I don't have all the answers, and I don't claim to have all the answers. And quite frankly, I like it when a student stumps me.
Yeah.
It happens less and less as the years go on, just because I become more experienced and I get those questions that stump me, and I go and I look for an answer.
No, yeah,
That's
I do that all
that's
the
the
time
fun.
myself. We just had a whole class about the question somebody asked the week before. How do you get out of this? And, well, here's here's one thing I can think of that fits with our our system in terms of techniques we know and tactics we apply, but I need to look into that more, right? So
Yeah,
did some research, and then we came back and did a little class on it. It was good for
yeah,
everybody. I learned,
it-
they learned, it was good.
yeah.
I think
And
just to,
that's a healthy attitude as an instructor, right there. That's a very healthy attitude.
yeah, thank you. I think just there's a big difference in how you ask the question too. We've said this a couple times, but like there's a difference between saying like, Master Dan, I think you're full of crap. That's never going to work, right? And saying, Master Dan, I'm having trouble understanding like how this fits with the rest of kind of stuff that we study. Can
Yeah,
you explain it to me a different way, or can you help me see this angle of it, or whatever? Right?
right.
People, even a highly ego-driven instructor likes it when you ask him for more of his knowledge, right? So if you can pose a question in that way, then that usually gets through to even the most, um, I'll use the word egocentric instructor.
Yeah, yeah. So that kind of leaves us. We're going to wrap up pretty quick here, but one kind of final thought is, what can't be taught or learned. What are you kind of stuck figuring out for yourself when it comes to these things in terms of strategy and tactics and technique? Um, and I
Yeah.
would I would venture to say that let's just take technique off the board real quick because I think overall technique is something that can always be learned. I think that's something that can readily be demonstrated and it may take time, but I think any technique can be taught and learned.
Yeah, I think you can show anybody a sequence of physical movements, and with enough practice, they can learn it, right? And that's really all a technique is at that point, right? It's like you're going to
Right.
do A, then B, then C, or whatever it is, right? So anybody can learn that. I think the common thing people say that you can't learn is timing.
Oh,
You can't teach, right? You can't
you
teach
can't.
time, right? Sparring, right, is another thing that you hear. But sparring is really about timing, right?
Well,
You teach them how to do the punches and the kicks and everything, but if they can't see the moment when it needs to be applied, you can't teach it because it's too dynamic, right?
as somebody who's been sparring for 30 years, I can tell you absolutely that sparring can be taught and it can be taught really well. And it is a teacher who understands these three things strategy, tactics, and technique who will make somebody a good sparrer. But if your method of teaching how to spar is to throw somebody in the ring and go, okay, pad up and go, that's not teaching, right? That's
Right.
trial and error. That's all that is.
Yeah.
That's not actually teaching somebody something. That's just trial and error. Um, there's an instructor out there who has a program. His name is Chris Rappold, and his program is called Retention Based Sparring. And the whole point of the program is that sparring is one of those things in the martial arts that is one of the things that kills people's martial arts careers. They go, I don't want to do it. I'm afraid of it.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
afraid
My
I'm going to
daughter's
hurt
doing
somebody. I'm afraid I'm going to get hurt. And so a lot of people, once they reach the point of, okay, it's time to spar, they go, I'm out. Um, and the whole point of his program is here's how you teach sparring. This is it's an instructional program in how to systematically teach somebody how to spar, so that you take away the fear and you add in more success, and it's less haphazard and less random when they succeed.
Yeah, interesting. I've never been in really an open sparring art before. Um, so I've never had to learn it. I've never had to really be taught it. I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
do sparring like drills in our system. I'm struggling to think of a good word to use to describe them, but like fast-paced multiple attacker, or at least sequential attacker type drills, that sort of force you to get the distance and the timing going on. I
Yeah.
think you can develop that skill, like a student can develop that skill, but I think it's one of those things that you can't really substitute the training for anything but there's no other techniques for, I'm tripping over my words here, but there's no substitute for practicing in that environment to develop those
Right.
skills, right?
Right. That's the thing that I tell students more than anything. I was taught an acronym for learning techniques a long time ago, and it's FAST: form, accuracy, speed, timing,
Right.
fast. And that's your order. You should acquire a new skill in the martial arts. Learn the form first so that you get it right, and then after that, you add in accuracy so that you can make sure you're applying it when and where, or where you should, how you should, and then start to add speed so you get better at it. But then the last one is timing. When do you do it? And the thing I tell my students is once you learn a technique, you can practice F, A, and S at home all you want. You can get those things and you can improve those at home, but it's very hard to improve timing at home unless you happen to have a speed bag, or something else that allows you to practice timing. You know, so yeah, that's a hard
So,
one.
so this would be a interesting topic to dive into maybe deeper in the future. Is there something in the martial arts that can't be taught? Maybe we could dive into some of the other sort of historically mentioned things and kind of weigh in on what we think. I
That'd be
don't think we'll
fun.
do that next time, though. I think we're gonna wrap this one up. And again, thank everyone who's listening and watching. We really appreciate the support. If you liked us, please let us know. Share, subscribe, comment, all that stuff that helps us get noticed by more people, so we can get out there and make this thing even bigger and better.
Yeah, we really hope you enjoyed today's program. And again, if you have further questions, you feel free to send them to us. Or if you have suggestions on topics you'd like to hear about, we are certainly happy to entertain those so that we can make sure you're getting the content you want to hear. Thanks again,
And
everybody.
absolutely. And next time, join us for our discussion on PETA. What is PETA? It is not an animal rights organization. It is a cycle, a mental cycle that we go through from perception all the way through action. So we'll break that down for you, talk about, share our thoughts on it, and we can't wait for you to join us. So thanks again, everybody. We're gonna go ahead and sign.
Take care. See you next time.